Thank you much, everyone, for your attendance. My name is Matt Hayduck. I'm the Chief Engineer for the NASA Robotic Spacecraft Protection Program hosted at Goddard Space Flight Center. It is my singular pleasure this morning to be able to introduce to you this distinguished panel of 4 experts in collision avoidance, conjunction assessment, and risk analysis for spacecraft protection. I'll go through and introduce each of them individually in a minute, but let me give you a short overview of how this panel is going to operate. It's divided into 3 parts where we'll address 3 different sets of questions. The briefing slides will make clear exactly what those are. After a few introductory slides, kind of set the stage and give some background for each. Then we'll begin to take questions from the audience. We will be taking the questions by text message. They will text to this iPad over here, and I'll get to see them as the moderator, then I can pose them to the group. Feel free to introduce a question directly to one of the 4 panelists or just in general to the plenary group of panelists. After about 20 to 25 minutes time on each topic, we'll move to the next one and then conclude at our regularly scheduled concluding time, even though we're getting started just a slight bit late. So let me go ahead and introduce our panelists now. Okay, it's working. All right, the first panelist, sitting closest to me, is Lori K. Newman. She is the acting manager of the NASA Robotic Conjunction Assessment Program, which is responsible for conjunction assessment, orbital safety of about 70 protected assets in all of the major orbit regimes. She's had 15 years experience prior to this as a flight dynamics engineer, supporting the missions that you see on the screen here, and then 10 years support to the particular center that oversees the robotic protection activities. Sitting to her left is Mr. William Howarth. He's the lead for the International Space Station Trajectory Operations Group at Johnson Space Center, NASA. And you can see what the duties of such a person are here on the slide: planning, analysis, operations for flight dynamics, trajectory integration, conjunction analysis, risk assessment, which is, of course, the focus of today's panel. 13 years experience as the flight controller, trajectory operator, supporting the ISS space shuttle programs with the particular manifest that you see here on the slide. To his left is Madame Monique Moury from CNES. She's the head of the Operational Flight Dynamics Group from the Centre National d'Études Spatiales, located in Toulouse, France, with the specific responsibilities shown here: station-keeping trajectory, maintenance for the CNES LEO satellites, operates the Orbital Computation Center, which is the multi-mission center that provides orbit determination for CNES, and is in charge of space surveillance operations, including the Kaisar support, which we'll talk about more, for 20 defended assets that her particular group protects. Nearly 30 years of service to CNES in the Flight Dynamics Division. And finally, to her left is Mr. Shinichi Nakamura, Senior Administrator of International Relations and Research for JAXA, the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency. Presently, he's serving as a visiting professor at the Asian Institute of Technology in Thailand, slightly north of Bangkok. Shinichi-san has worked normally as the manager of the JAXA Flight Dynamics team, whose duties included what we see here: conjunction analysis, risk mitigation, risk assessment, flight dynamics activities, and space surveillance, including the deployment of radars and optical instruments for space surveillance, data collection, and orbit determination. So it's my distinguished pleasure to have these 4 experts here to talk about issues of importance to all of us in the CA community and to take your questions. So here are the 3 areas that we're going to examine today. The first of these is CA international cooperation and policy. The second is CA risk assessment. We'll talk a little bit about what risk assessment is, and then the concept of a middleman group to perform risk assessments for conjunction assessment and mitigation. And finally, a session on open technical problems in conjunction assessment. So let's begin with the first portion. I'm going to give a few introductory slides here about some of the issues in this area. The most visible and important event, I think, in the CA community was the definition of what we're calling the conjunction data message. This is a CCSDS message format, multi-year effort with the full international community to develop and promulgate a data type and formatted message to exchange data among users for CA purposes. This was an important milestone, both for what it developed and actually bringing everyone together to develop it. But there are many other areas that exist that can benefit from international cooperation, and we're going to talk briefly about 4 of them here. One would be registration of CA-related points of contact to facilitate information exchange. the use of what we're calling canned conjunction alert data messages, the deployment of an orbital registry to prevent potential conjunctions that we know of in advance, and finally, the CA issues that are raised by small satellite deployments. So let's talk about each one of those in turn. Point of contact registration, this seems pretty obvious and straightforward. For conjunction between two active satellites, a direct communication between the owner-operators is the best way to determine how to mitigate the conjunction. The CDM message that was just formulated has features to allow the exchange of point of contact information in that message. Spacetrack.org has owner-operator registration capabilities, including a searchable directory of owner-operators so that you can actually get a hold of their point of contact information. And finally, SDA membership gives a similar service for entities that are registered with that particular middleman. The Spacetrack.org directory feature is not well known. There are only about 25 organizations presently registered, at least the last time we investigated the matter. And methods for improving the exchange of point of contact information really should be pursued in greater depth. Do we need a technical group to do this? Should it be pursued through diplomatic channels? Do we need some international guidelines to help people fill out what has been provided by spacetrack.org so that it's the most meaningful? So this is one area where we certainly need to apply some thought time. However, there are certainly instances where we have data sharing agreements between a number of entities, but not among all entities or all combinations of them. So what do we do when a conjunction arises between two active satellites from countries that don't have an SSA sharing agreement? There are no points of contact established between the two groups. Any content or communication usually has to flow through diplomatic channels. This becomes very cumbersome very quickly. One approach that has been proposed is to establish canned messages that can be sent through diplomatic channels. This would be like playing Mad Libs with the State Department. You work out the basic text and get that ironed out, and then there are blanks you can fill in for some of the technical information for the conjunction at hand. And you tweaked the text in advance to avoid translation errors. For example, if you take the word satellite, go to Google Translate, translate it to an Asian language, then translate it back into English, usually you get the word moon. So if you take a full message and do this a couple times, you really get to see that this is not as simple as it sounds. So having this all worked out in advance can help support the exchange of information through diplomatic channels when timelines are important. However, this is still far from ideal, and usually you won't actually get to the point where there's direct exchange possible. Another idea that's been proposed is to formulate an orbital registry to help predict or prevent predictable conjunctions. The ITU does something along these lines for RFI mitigation for geosynchronous satellites and perhaps for others as well. There's no comparable agency to mitigate satellite potential conjunctions. Co-location of satellites, orbit choices that will produce repeating conjunctions, which can usually be determined by fairly simplistic analysis, or then orbit changes in any existing payloads that would put them in a situation where this would become a problem. An orbital registry would help identify and prevent problems like this. It would be like a wedding registry to make sure two people don't buy the same gift, right? You'd register your satellite, where you're going to go, what you're going to do, so when someone else comes along and wishes to populate a particular orbit regime, they could have access to this registry and know what sorts of problems they would be creating both for themselves and for somebody else. So this has been another idea that's been floated as a way to address or improve the international communication and cooperation. And finally, a topic that's already surfaced multiple times so far is changes that have been brought to CA due to small satellite deployments. Small satellites, whether microsatellites, nanosatellites, picosatellites, present a new set of problems for us. They're more difficult to track, both for initial cataloging and tracking and then routine maintenance, because they're harder to observe with the sensors that we have. They're deployed in large groups, usually, so that invites cross-tagging and trying to straighten out this mess, especially quickly, is very difficult. So they pose unmitigated conjunction hazards, usually for a considerable period of time until after their deployment, everything kind of settles down. There are no international agreements or policies for identifying and mitigating the hazards that this particular class of satellites are posing for us. And some of the ideas that have been floated for standards that could be implemented are shown here. Should there be a minimum size for microsatellites? Should there be a minimum number you can deploy per burst? Should there be conjunction mitigation standards for that period of time between when you deploy them and when they can really get tracked and get in the catalog and follow the regular procedure? Those are all ideas. Maybe they have value. Not a whole lot has been done with them. So there's, just to kind of get things going, there are some particular problems that were looking at right now in terms of international cooperation and collaboration. You see this slide up here. It lists the 4 areas that we've talked about, identifies who the panelists are, and gives you the text number to which to text your questions. So let's open the floor to questions at this time. I'll start off with one while we're all getting started. We've talked about establishing points of contact between technical groups that actually fly satellites to try to mitigate conjunction hazard. Do we think points of contact are enough? Is that going to get us very far? Or do we really need some kind of international group or body that kind of serves as a general overseer for this whole problem and meets with some regularity, provides guidance, helps to formulate standards? We all know that not everyone will follow standards, but it would at least force the community to get together, give a forum for figuring this sort of thing out. And that, I don't know, would that take us a lot further than simply having the kind of the individualistic exchange of point of contact information that keeps this from being a community activity and just makes it individual pairs of persons? Who'd like to take a stab at that one?
Okay, I'll start. Certainly having individual points of contact has worked for NASA in the past. When we've had close approaches with satellites that we didn't have agreements with, we could go to the JSPOC and ask them to give us contact information if they had it, and then we were able to reach out to that organization through our headquarters, and depending on what kind of agreement NASA as an agency had with that entity, we're able to go down one of various paths to get to them. But I've also seen over the years different organizations like the AIAA or AAS start to form groups where we can get together and talk about the technical issues, but each group has kind of had a different spin on it or has picked off part of the problem, and there's no sort of organization in charge that really has taken the ball and run with it for this area, because it overlaps so many different areas. And so that would certainly be a good thing to have, but I think both probably have a place in what needs to be set up.
Yeah. Mr. Howarth, I'd like you to comment on that, particularly from an ISS perspective.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting, an evolving process. Like Lori mentioned, we've actually, just even within our own agency, I'm on the human spaceflight side of things, and Lori's responsible for the robotic aspects of NASA's spaceflight. And even some specific examples that have come along just in the last year or two, in themselves take a good amount of coordination and work to make it happen seamlessly. Some examples are just some recent agreements we've had between coordinating ISS maneuvers with respect to trim and GPM, for example. And it goes through, and again, we're just within the same agency, and putting together those agreements takes some work. It takes some, the usual stuff that we've talked about in SSA forums, yesterday even, is making sure that everyone's on the same timeline, that the formats are readable by everybody, and that everybody understands what the marching orders are. We had a sort of a similar situation within the last year. It's not exactly an on-orbit situation, but you mentioned these small CubeSats, as I'll talk about in a second here. Right now, Station has become a platform for deploying a lot of small CubeSats. And we've gone through a recent coordination effort where we were going to deploy several dozen satellites earlier this year at the same time that GPM was launching, and we had to go through a coordination to make sure that essentially we weren't presenting a risk by dropping a cluster of satellites into the exact orbit that one of Goddard's satellites was headed to. So I think it's a sort of the long answer to this is a complicated problem, even when you're dealing with a single government agency, and then when you throw in the United States and other government agencies, it's a hard problem to solve.
So what I'm starting to take away from you two is that it really does go beyond points of contact. Even if we can talk to each other, the problems are often severe enough that simply a simple phone conversation doesn't resolve it. So let me move that on to our international participants here. Madame Moury, would you agree with that while individual points of contact maybe can solve immediate problems some of the time, in general, there needs to be more participation with some sort of governing body that would force us to take cognizance of and move forward on some of these more enduring coordination problems?
Yes, I think points of contact are very important. And first of all, but it's not enough. But I think also CESPOC has done very interesting things when they implemented the CDM from CCSDS quite recently. And they organized and they put in place a registry on the website, this SpaceTrack website. And I believe that this registry is not well known enough. And with that registry, it would allow different organizations, it allows different organizations to put contact and always update the contact. CESPOC in the past few years organized very interesting things, I think, and they were I think they called them CDM workshops. And CDM workshops were really a very interesting group organization to meet all the people involved and to discuss and to exchange about the way we all work and to make possible to know the best way we could exchange ideas and way to do and points of contact. And when I look at the registry on the SpaceTrack website, as you mentioned, I think not so many people knows that it exists. And it's a shame because it's very useful when you get a CDM and the secondary involved is also an operational satellite. You don't have much time to find to whom you should speak. And if the operator has put email address, for instance, very concrete thing, and then you can email the operator, or you already experienced that, and I can tell you that it was really very efficient. So I think we should go forward and keep on organizing workshops. I know that US Strat or CESPOC, maybe sometimes I get missed about all US organization. I hope you excuse me. They try to organize a new one. I think it's a very good idea, and I'm really in favor of that. And on fresh side, I can mention maybe that we plan to organize a collision avoidance workshop in May in Paris next year. And we plan to invite all operators, and the objective will be to share between us the way we work and to try to improve and to know each other and to benefit from each other's experience and feedback in order for all of us to improve our method.
Very good. So Shinichi-san, let me focus the question slightly. It's clear that having points of contact is helpful. One of the worries we sometimes have well, I'll be bold and speak for the United States. As soon as we identify an easy fix, that becomes the full fix, and we never get momentum to go forward. So I'd like to hear your perspective on, do we need some kind of international body to help with this? I mean, I think it's great what Madame Mouly is proposing. She's going to run a workshop next year. But it's interesting that even then, that's kind of a unilateral effort on behalf of CNES. We're not looking to an international body, at least not yet, to take ownership of this and kind of move it forward, as would be more typical for a scientific organization. So what do you think our next step should be?
Yes, I agree to Monica and other comment. And I agree to point of contact, a list of the point of contact is very useful. And we always connect to some agency and the satellite operators, but sometimes we cannot find the operator and the point of contact. And moreover, when we find the point of contact, we communicate with each other, but at that time there is no common rule and common guideline. So next step, at first, we would like to establish the point of contact of list. Next step is that we need to do the guideline or how to communicate to each other. At that time, in my image, JSBOK shows a very useful common rule. So in my image, someone such as UN Compass and other agency shows, explains the guideline and how to communicate to each other.
Okay, very good. So I think we're kind of getting a consensus that some sort of international presence or body ought to take cognizance of that. Let me pair that with another question. We talk about an orbital registry that would, at first it would be an informational entity, but in principle, if it didn't have some sort of at least moral authority, it wouldn't really do very much. Is this a good idea, or is this like Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations, where it sounded really good and kind of in a progressive era, we went forward with it, and how it's done in terms of actually accomplishing its objectives is a mixed bag. Do we think that we'd end up going through a lot of bureaucratic machinations to produce something that at the end would largely be ignored and not particularly useful, or do we think really people would align behind such an idea? I couldn't even hear the negotiations, so I'm curious about them.
Thanks for that question, Matt. So, this is an idea that came up at Goddard because we were concerned about conjunction problems we'd had in the past where another civil spacecraft had maneuvered to change its orbit while it was already on orbit, and then proceeded to walk through a constellation of spacecraft, an international constellation that we participated in, and had close approaches with all of those spacecraft. And so we were looking for ways that we could have prevented that in the beginning. And we realized if we had shared more information with each other and talked about the plans before they were actually executed, that it could have very easily been avoided. So to me, having something like that, certainly it's not going to solve every problem, but it at least offers solutions for some of those types of problems.
Yeah, I agree because, for instance, I think for GEO, that's the example you chose. It's quite obvious, and you might think that for LEO maybe it could be more difficult, but and you could think first that you could have a look at space track, at TLEs, public TLEs, to know where are the operational satellites in order to choose your orbit, your operational orbit for the future satellite. But sometimes what you don't have in TLEs are future satellites. So in fact, you can make the same choice than another entity. So I think, yes, it would be a great help. And I agree, it would not solve anything, but I think it would help. I don't know how to put it in place, but that would be an help.
Okay, so we've got a panel of optimists, or at least two of the four. That's good. I want to change direction a little bit because we're getting a lot of questions about microsatellites coming in here. I'll combine a couple of, well, I'll ask it in two parts. The interlocutors proposed two possibilities for microsats. One would be some sort of requirement for beaconing or announcement of position. So that could be, whether that actually came off, broadcast from the satellite directly, or was just simply made available perhaps on a website so that the ephemerides would be known of microsats. That could be a way that we deal with it from a CA perspective. The other would be to define orbital bands for launching microsats, where we would just accept that those would be the dangerous parts of town, as it were, and you fly there at your own risk, and we don't really worry about CA operations in those areas. How do you feel about these two proposals for how to deal with microsats? Or do you think we've been unduly pessimistic and that our processes maybe are robust than we really think and we don't need to be recommending something this draconian and invasive? Lark, why don't you start?
Okay, yeah, I'll jump into this. This year has really been a very busy year for us in learning how to deal with CubeSats and other small satellites that especially are being deployed from ISS, or in many cases deployed as part of a mission to ISS. For example, bringing a commercial capsule to the station, and then the upper stage on that vehicle then goes off to a secondary mission to deliver other satellites. So this has become a pretty big issue for us. I think, you know, at least in the case of human spaceflight, as far as the altitude bands and the orbital regimes, we've tried to guide through our safety process a little bit of ensuring that anyone deploying small satellites as, you know, not coming from station, but as part of a mission to station, that they do so in a way that the essentially the perigee stays above ISS or the apogee stays below ISS. And we also go through a secondary check of whether there are any visiting vehicles that happen to be coming within a couple of weeks of that period, so that we make sure that the space is clear, essentially. So that's become a very big issue for us. And one of the, you know, I'd say that this business about knowing where things are, even if you neglect visiting vehicles coming to station, this problem of knowing exactly where these things are after you've put them into the environment has become a very challenging issue. How, you know, it's one thing just to, even for ISS, we can deploy 30 CubeSats and we can do it in a way that's very safe for us, but it could become everyone else's problem. And so we're really struggling to work through deploy schemes that essentially maybe space out these deployments so that the space surveillance network has a chance to essentially catch up, so that it minimizes the amount of time it takes for the folks out at JSPOC to get the tracking, to figure out which observations go to which satellite, and make it so that that stuff can actually be cleanly associated into the catalog so that the rest of the spacefaring community knows what they're up against. You know, again, I'm making it sound like this is a big bad world, and we're just trying to be responsible in this. We all know that the science, you know, ISS is a science platform. That's our goal in life. So we are trying to do everything we can to enable these people who have CubeSats to get overboard, do the science they need to do whatever commercial activities they need to do, because we're here to support that, but we're trying to do it in a way that makes it responsible and safe for the rest of the community.
And Mr. Howarth's given us a great summary of the mitigation activities that they've taken, but I noticed he's definitely sidestepped the question of whether we need actually to tighten the thumb screws and start demanding some of these other products. Shinichi-san, yes. I'd like your opinion on that. Do you think, especially as somebody who's an active space debris researcher, do you think we're at the point with small satellites that it would be best that we mandate either their making their ephemerides available to people or severely restricting the orbital regimes in which they'd be allowed to be deployed?
Yeah, microsatellite is a very different problem for us. So, but I agree to make a rule to the I agree to the size of the satellite is bigger than the observable size of radar, but it is impossible to decide the detail because it depends on the altitude. So we cannot have the sensor to track the satellites. So we always take that two line. So now there is only one possibility to so we depend on the JSPOC now. And sorry, I don't know. It's okay. It's a very difficult question.
Okay, well, Mrs. Newman has never been known to be shy.
So I guess there's a problem with choosing particular altitudes where you could put CubeSats just in the paradigm that they're currently using in launching them, because right now they're being piggybacked onto various vehicles to go up. In addition to launching on station, if they go up on an unmanned vehicle, they're being taken to whatever altitude that unmanned vehicle is going to. A lot of them have loose science constraints and they have that kind of flexibility, but that means they're just being dumped off wherever that vehicle is going. So although there's a requirement to reconnect with the payload that it was launched with, there's no requirement to analyze the trajectory to see whether it's going to hit something else that it might be dropping these things off right above, other high-valued assets that are in that area. So at the very least, I think there needs to be some kind of analysis to ensure that that's the case during that first period when the CubeSat isn't being tracked anyway. But, you know, saying they have to go to a certain altitude band, I don't think fits with the fact that they're not paying and they're being piggybacked on other launchers.
Okay, so we're getting a very accommodating NASA position, which is, I think we should all be grateful for that. Okay, we're going to go to the next phase of this, and if you've sent in some questions that weren't taken, don't despair. Some of these will be repurposed because they actually fit better into a phase into which we're moving, which is risk analysis and the middleman concept. Now, usually when we talk about CA at conferences like this, we talk about CA screenings. And a screening is the determination of all close approaches of space objects to a particular protected asset at a future time. And this problem, especially with brute force techniques, is quite solvable. And it lends itself nicely to parallelization. So a lot of work has been done in the past on trying to improve the efficiency of screenings, and I think we're grateful for those efforts. But at least in the CA community, we largely regard this problem as having been solved. And then on the CDM that we've talked about, here's the kind of information you get after a screening. For both objects, you get first-tier data, what I'll call state estimates, covariances at the time of closest approach. You can therefore calculate the miss distance and a word you'll hear a lot during this presentation, the probability of collision between the two objects. You also get second-tier data. You get the OD force model settings, quality indicators, tracking densities. So you get a fair amount of information when you get one of these CDMs. To the outside observer, it would seem like the problem's solved now. You've got all the information you need. Actually, the problem is just beginning, because now you have to make a risk assessment of each individual encounter. So let's talk about some interpretation issues here. How about uncertainties in the PC calculation? You've got a covariance, but there are known difficulties in producing an accurate covariance using the a priori methodology, namely the inverse of the norm matrix. There's uncertainty in atmospheric density projections, especially when solar activity is busy. So you usually get an in-track position offset or a larger variance. And then if you actually play around with the covariance in the PFC calculation and scale it in a bunch of different directions to try to compensate for perhaps misformation, you can find you can drive the PC to some very high values. You can take events that weren't risky and all of a sudden make them look very risky. So this is kind of an interesting and somewhat controversial technique that's in play by some analysts. There's uncertainty in the hard body radius. The hard body radius is the combined sizes of the two spacecrafts that you use to try to determine whether there's likely to be a conjunction. And there are a lot of different ways you can calculate this. You can circumscribe them in spheres and take the size of the sphere. You can look at projected areas. You can try to figure out what the projected area is actually going to be at the time of closest approach. The PFC is sensitive to this parameter, but not as much as the covariance, even though it's the easier problem to solve. Then there's the whole question of OD quality. You get these insight metrics provided in your CDM. You get the weighted RMS of the OD update. You get percent residual acceptance. You get tracking densities. That's all wonderful. But what's the interpretation of those? When is the weighted RMS bad? It's supposed to be unity. Is a 1.2 a bad number? What about 1.5, 2, 3? When do you say it's bad? When have you thrown out enough residuals that you think you don't have a bad or a good OD anymore? And when have you propagated something so long you no longer believe the results? What's the shelf life of that vector? 2 days, 3 days, 5 days? Oh, it's orbit regime dependent. Yes, but okay, once you've nailed down the orbit regime, what is it? There's no simple answers to these. And this is where analyst experience really becomes important. Then there's the life cycle of events. If you've been involved in the CA community, you've seen curves like this before. What you're looking at here is the ratio of the miss distance. The x-axis, the ratio of the size of the covariance to the miss distance. And then the y-axis is the base 10 log of the PFC. And what you see is way out, many days before TCE, the PFC tends to be low, and then the natural life cycle, as you get closer to TCA, you're propagating the covariance for less time. So usually that makes the PFC go up until it hits a maximum when the ratio is the square root of 2. And then very quickly after that, it drops off. So one of the things you do as a risk analyst, at any given moment, you're trying to figure out where you are on this curve. Have you already rounded the top, and therefore you can expect a big drop, and you can tell somebody not to maneuver? Or do you think you're way down here and things are going to get a lot better? Or do you think for this particular conjunction, it's not going to follow this curve, it's going to do something else? That's not so easy to determine without experience, and even then it's not so easy. So for these reasons and others, this middleman concept has arisen, where agencies have elected to employ a dedicated group to perform this function. It's a dedicated team that does just risk analysis, not screenings. They get the screening information for the JSPOC. They just interpret the results. So it stands between the JSPOC and the owner-operator, receives JSPOC data, it provides interpretation, makes mitigation recommendations, then assists in performing maneuvers, planning them, so that the post-maneuver state is truly going to remediate the risk that's believed to exist. And you build up interpretive expertise because you work thousands of conjunctions. NASA Goddard, CNES, and JAXA have all taken this approach. JSC has taken a hybrid version of it. They are the single center for this, for vehicles under JSC control, but they act as a middleman for other missions that will actually be interacting with the space station. So let's go back to questions now. Here's again a summary of what we just talked about. And let's talk about risk analysis and how that works for the middleman. And a question came in earlier that says, how do small owner-operators deal with this whole CA concept? Well, we could just kind of flash the sign and say they use the middleman, and this is a paid political advertisement. We could do that, but I think what I want to turn to the panel, and maybe they'll give a slightly, well, not biased, but nuanced responses. What about really small owner-operators? Do we feel like our processes accommodate that? Madame Mouli, what would you say to maybe a small owner of a couple microsats if they wanted to participate in CA? Is the CNES paradigm and its rate structure really available to someone in that situation?
Yes and no. At CNES, as you mentioned in the introduction, we deliver a service that we call Kaiser, and that's a middleman service. So it means that we help operators to analyze or to perform the risk assessment and to determine if according to threshold on which we agreed before, the conjunction is a threat, and and if avoidance action should be considered. But of course, we have a group of satellites for which we provide that service, but we also deliver or provide to any operators wishing to get it, a software that helps to work with CDM. In order to provide our service Kaiser, we had to develop a dedicated tool to work with CDM. I mean, to analyze the CDM and to be able to determine between all the data we get, which are the top 10 data that you have to analyze. Because when you get CDM for a fleet of satellites, you get a large amount of data. When I mean a large amount of data, is hundreds of CDMs you can get per day. So you won't analyze them just looking at them like that. You have to have an automated process. And the reason why you need to have a large amount of data is to be able to take into account maneuvers. Because, of course, JSPOC is not able to guess what the next station-keeping maneuvers, for instance, that such and such satellites are going to perform. So a way to share the burden of conjunction assessment is to have the JSPOC delivering CDMs with large criteria and middleman entity receiving those large criteria for CDM. So it means that with the knowledge of the maneuvers that the group of spacecraft they deal with are going to perform, they're able to take into account maneuvers and deliver and really provide help to the operators to identify the risky conjunctions.
Okay, well, let me follow that up with you and therefore set you up for a question that's just come in. If I were to subscribe to your service and use the JAC software, will it actually make a maneuver recommendation for me, or will it merely give me supporting data, but I have to decide ultimately whether I should take a remedial action or not?
the operator always keeps the decision. If you take the service, you will have advice from the Kaiser team, from our team. If you take the software, then you'll have to perform the analysis on your side, and you will also have to take the decision. But in any cases, and I think it's exactly the same for Kara team, from Lori, or for JAXA, or even for you, we provide advices. We are really ready, and we need to have a dialogue with the flight dynamics team in order to find together the best way to perform an avoidance action, minimizing the impact for the station keeping of the satellites. But in any cases, a decision has to be taken by the operators. We don't take that rule for them, and I think it's important.
Okay, well, that sets us up nicely for this question. Who assumes the liability when a middleman concept is pursued? Let's sketch out a hypothetical. We've got an upcoming conjunction, information comes in, a middleman agency reviews it, provides a risk assessment, a particular action is, let's say an avoidance action is not pursued, and then there is a collision. Where do we think the liability for that entire chain of events shakes out?
With the highest level of management possible. No, I mean, typically, an operator has to balance the risk of the conjunction against the risk of performing a maneuver. Anytime you fire your propulsion system, you're incurring risk for your spacecraft. So ultimately, they're making the decision, and whoever their line management is would ultimately be responsible for taking action or not. Certainly, as advisors, if we disagreed with the decision, at least for the Kara team, we would take that up to NASA management and make them aware that this decision, that there was some discussion about the decision, but ultimately it's above our pay grade.
And I would say that's true for civil space. What if this concept were pursued for a commercial entity?
I mean, we can't tell the commercial entity what to do, and there's no regulatory agency, so until there's a space traffic management authority, there is no way right now to do that.
I think that's right. And in the third part of this, we'll talk about how do we validate CA processes in the absence of real truth criteria, because the truth criterion is really only the collision, and that happens so rarely. So I think, I don't want to put words in the panel's mouth, but it's an ambiguous liability situation, is it not? I mean, the middleman provides advice. In a way, it provides recommendations, sort of, but it doesn't actually provide the decision. So let me ask this. Mr. Howarth, this is probably a good one for you. Who bears the responsibility then of protecting the space corridors, right? I mean, when we think about this, we tend to think about it in mission-specific terms. We're protecting a satellite. In a way, that's right, but we're not just doing that. We're protecting particular orbit regimes that are of particular interest to certain scientific missions. And, you know, as somebody who defends the ISS, maybe the quintessential example of that. So, for example, when you determine your own risk posture toward the station, how much of that considers the orbital regime in addition to the, protecting the lives of the people on board and the investment?
Yeah, we actually, we do take that into account. Needless to say, the fact that we've got 6 human beings on board is the primary concern. We've got a $100 billion laboratory we're trying to protect, but at the same time, we also understand that any of the ramifications of a bad decision we make affects everyone else in that orbit regime. And of course, we're in a relatively low orbit. We're in the 415 kilometer-ish range. But some of the decisions we make, for example, when one of our vehicles, let's say a Russian Progress, departs station, and let's say it's going off on a 7-day or 14-day lunar excursion before it actually deorbits. We do actually work with the Russians to try to protect that vehicle, even though it's no longer a part of station anymore. The space station program has essentially said it's not ours, but we know that any collision with that object, with the Progress, will affect ISS and it'll affect any of the satellites that are underneath us. So we always take that into account. And again, with the CubeSats that we deploy, we also take that into account in when we deploy it and how we do it, so that at least there's enough situational awareness among the rest of the community at our altitude or lower, that people have as much opportunity to avoid this as they can if they're maneuverable.
Shinichi-san, what about from your perspective? When you oversaw the CA operations,
Yes.
how did you play off the differences between protecting simply the mission payload itself and protecting the orbit regime from debris production?
Yes, yeah, but we don't have a special technique, but we always same manner as CNES or NASA. But I want to say about the middleman concept. I would like to introduce a recent activity of JAXA. In JAXA sometimes play a middleman for the Japanese companies. But recently we start the challenge to the capacity building for the commercial satellite company and private satellite operation companies. For example, JAXA teach how to calculate the probability of collision, how to understand the CDM, and how to perform the conjunction analysis, and how to calculate the necessity or how to engineering the system. About 3 or 4 years ago, we went to the America and we learned from the CSM workshop, and now we teach the Japanese company. According to our education, in Japan, good satellite operator is growing now in Japan. So in Japan, we have two major points. One is the middleman concept, other is the capacity building. Thank you very much.
I understand. Okay, this is a good one for Mrs. Newman. Do the customers of Middleman Services accept your recommendations on blind faith?
No. No, but in general, we've built up a group who have expertise in this area, and there's a lot of collaboration between the mission customers and the middleman, so that we can learn about each other's process and try to make recommendations that are in keeping with what the mission can do, and the mission understanding why the CARA team is making the recommendation it's making, and then try to come up with kind of a compromise mitigation that meets everyone's needs.
Madame Mouly, is your experience similar?
Yes, exactly. The idea is really to provide, to help the flight dynamics team to really understand why we recommend an avoidance action, and to really exchange each one constraints, the station keeping constraints and the risky level constraints, in order to find the best avoidance action for both. So to mitigate the risk and not change too much the orbit, the mission orbit.
In your experience, do you find that your owner-operators tend to be more conservative or more liberal vis-a-vis your recommendation? Maneuvering protects the satellite, but it expends fuel and reduces payload lifetime. So one could imagine that owner-operators might be very protective of their satellites and therefore be willing to maneuver freely in order to protect it, or they might be very focused on their mission and therefore not want to perturb their mission and accept more risk. In the main, do you find that your owner-operators lean toward one of the two of those extremes, or is it a broad spectrum of possibilities?
For me, I think operators we have in interface, they would like to perform the few avoidance maneuver that they can, but they don't want to take risk. So in fact, they dialogue with us, and they try they need really to be convinced that the conjunction is really risky. And if we demonstrate the level of risk of the conjunction. I think I don't have an example in mind where we recommended avoidance action and the avoidance action was not done. So in fact, in the end, for our experience, avoidance actions are always done when we recommend one. We have a dialogue before, maybe they want really to be convinced, they would like us to say, maybe you could do nothing, but if we don't agree with that, then they perform the avoidance action.
Just to apply this to ISS, for example, we've actually seen that there's no single answer, that it's almost a cultural, it depends on who's operating that vehicle between the two commercial partners we've got Europeans, Japanese, Russians, they all tend to they come from a different angle on how skeptical or how eager they are to take this topic seriously.
Okay.
And I'm going to rephrase that. Not take this topic seriously, but
Degree of
how
urgency
they
they assign.
weigh the risks and benefits of taking a certain action changes from partner to partner.
Okay. Let's take a final question for this sector, although, again, some more of these questions will flow over into the next one. This is an interesting question. How much post-processing is done after the event to try to determine how prescient your particular predictions were? Let's start with Mrs. Newman on that.
So we're in the process of setting up a more rigorous approach to this. But in general, if we have a very threatening event, we do collect definitive solutions after the event and go back and try to see what actually happened in the best of our ability. And if there are lessons learned from a particular event, if the event unfolded a certain way and the actions that were taken led us to learn something new, we try to capture those and apply them to future conjunctions. But we're going to try to do this in a more automated fashion in the future so that we're able to apply it to more events so that hopefully we can learn more from the experiences that we have.
Would anyone else like to comment on that, or should we let that be our statement?
In fact, the question is about validation or not.
Oh, well, only in a narrow sense. Not so much validating software, but examining the encounter ex post facto to try to determine how well one's predictions aligned with the situation that actually adhered at TCA. That usually requires having OCMs produced for the so-called definitive solution, which is not available to many users.
Yes, for international user, maybe I could there. CDMs are only made available so far up until time of close approach, what we call TCA. So it means that we never get a chance to have determinated part of the ephemeris. I mean the part including the measurements, the observation measurements. And that's the best, that's where you have the best accuracy. But for the CDM, we get, as international entity, we only have CDMs before TCA, so we don't have that part. It would be really an improvement, or maybe it would be a way to validate, as that's what I could validate in some way, if we could get CDM after TCA, not a long time, but let's say maybe one day or time enough to get that determinated part of the ephemeris in order to check what our assumption was toward this more accurate part of the ephemeris.
Indeed. And it can be our hope that someday such a product will be available. All right, let us move on to the third part, which is open technical problems and conjunction assessment. A lot of progress has been made in the CA domain in the 10 years it's been kind of actively pursued. We've come up with efficient forms of doing the screenings. There's general agreement on the two-dimensional form of the PC calculation. There seems to be general agreement on when Monte Carlo approaches are required. There's still some debates about non-Gaussian area volumes and that sort of thing, but we're kind of converging on a solution. A lot of work has been done. but that doesn't preclude a remaining open, large number of open problems. And we'll talk about 5 in miniature here, but of course feel free to ask questions about any that you know about. So we'll talk about autonomous orbit control and the problems that poses, electric propulsion and the problems that poses, non-conservative forces, that affects all of us, validation, and then finally non-discrete conjunction assessment. So more and more satellites are using autonomous orbit control paradigms where station keeping, other flight dynamics activities have moved on board for efficiency. And then future ephemerides for those satellites are often not available in advance of the execution. The station keeping constraints are large compared to what we're used to in CA, hundreds of meters of constraint rather than maybe tens of meters. Iridium used to do this before February 2010. Now they've modified things to incorporate a collision avoidance interface. But how should CA in general be adapted to this growing way that things are being done? Maybe limiting maneuvers within a very small screening volume about the asset, time delays, so what the satellite wants to do can be sent back to Earth, so it can be looked at before it's uploaded and given the go-ahead, or some kind of onboard autonomous CA capability. It seems kind of space age-ish, as it were, but I guess it's a possibility. Electric propulsion, this is kind of stressing our classical CA techniques. The magnitude of the maneuvers is much smaller, and they will go over a much longer period, so this whole idea of modeling impulsive burns really doesn't work very well. Maybe we just give up and say CA is not possible for such satellites. Seems a shame to give up on a mission as important as this. Maybe we have to adapt the avoidance action criteria, mitigate only very high-risk conjunctions for such situations, move up the decision time to allow for longer burns. These are a couple ideas, but again, there's no consensus even within the people who work on this every day about what to do here. Non-conservative forces, we all know about this. Atmospheric density estimation probably is the one that receives more focus. Obviously, it's the major input to the satellite drag acceleration vector. Solar, extreme ultraviolet, and geomagnetic activity governs this, as well as solar storms. Difficult to predict, difficult to model. We need better models. Physics-based models would be nice. Accompanying error statements of those models would be even nicer, because then this could be folded into the covariance and used explicitly. Solar radiation pressure, gaining in importance as more things go out to GEO. Present models are usually first order. To make them more complicated often takes a lot of a priori knowledge. We need something better to do here. And again, accompanying error statements are important. Validation. This is an interesting issue here. Many organizations have a requirement to validate their processes. This is difficult for CA. If you build a radar, you can turn it on and pretty much know whether it's working or not. It's not quite that simple, but your available truth data are much greater. Here, the truth data we really only have are the actual collisions. There are very few of those, so that just doesn't establish anything. There have been very few historical collisions. Collisions remain possible even with the best CA. All you're doing is talking about probabilities, so the fact that a collision did happen doesn't invalidate your process. Validation becomes very difficult here. What's the best way to validate? What's the best way to show the inherent value of what we're doing? And then finally, non-discrete CA. Right now, the number of objects are small enough that individual discrete conjunctions can be handled as individual discrete conjunctions. In the future, the catalog may not be so indulgent. If we have a few more debris-producing events like we've had over the last 5 to 7 years, or we turn on more sensitive radars like the Space Fence, which is supposed to go live later in this decade, the catalog could very quickly grow to greater than 100,000 objects or even more. There's no need to debate the number today, but what's clear is if we're looking at that many objects, the number of individual events will become very large, and we will need a whole different paradigm for how to execute this mission, I believe anyway. Maybe we'll need to do extremely long-term screenings, look at cumulative probabilities, and then mitigate only to try to reduce the overall cumulative probability, or maybe we need to move some kind of cloud-based CA, where you're talking totally in a probabilistic or Bayesian framework all the time. We just don't know, and not a whole lot of work, very little work, in fact, has been done on this. So those are 5 kind of futuristic problems that we may be looking at, and we're happy to take questions on more. Let's begin, though, with the issue of validation. And let's take up a question that came in during the last section here. Is there an open-sourced, validated software suite for flight dynamics OD and CA that would wrap all that up and therefore be available for people who wanted to move this mission into their own ops centers.
None that I know of. What we've got at Johnson Space Center is something that it's just evolved from equations in a paper to early versions of software, and it's just evolved gradually over time in order to take into account the lessons we've learned and all these subtleties of the science that we've been able to incorporate over time. So from where I sit, I don't know other than the fundamentals, the equations that tell you how to take a state vector and a covariance, throw them together and compute a collision probability. That's coded up and anybody can grab that. But it's the sort of this soft science, how do you interpret the data? How do you look at the subtleties of the data you're getting and really make a smart decision? That's one of the things that I don't know, at least from where I sit, that there's anything like that can sort of be the smart thinker for just anyone to buy off the shelf.
For validations, I think like you, I don't know something really available, but what we performed, and I think it's very useful, is to perform comparisons with entities doing the same job, in fact. And on our side, we had the opportunity to both work with JAXA and with CARA team from NASA. And we perform comparison on a large set of data. And I know it's not a proof that what we do is good, is true, but when we had differences, we looked for the reason why, and we found the reason why, and now I think because we were able to compare methods which were developed in really different ways but provide the same results, it's a way to validate, I would say.
And I just want to add to this that it's one thing to come up to calculate a collision probability for any given instance. And this kind of goes to one of the earlier bullets in this chart here about justifying to your programs the need for doing this. And I think it's really important for everyone who's got satellites to take a look. None of us wants an Iridium Cosmos collision to happen again. That's the obvious thing that's in everybody's mind right now. But it's very important to weigh that with, again, the consequences of whatever kind of a strategy you want to take. To be a very extreme case, even on the space station, you go back to the early days, back in 1999, and we attempted to do our first debris avoidance maneuver, which failed, and we were not that far from losing space station in its infancy. There were a lot of reasons for it, but the point being there can be heavy consequences if you're actually trigger happy as well as not doing anything. So it's worth everyone looking at their mission, what the consequences of taking evasive maneuvers is, how often you expect to have to do it, and weigh that against the systems, how robust your systems are, how cleanly operating your ops team is. Do you expect them to be able to make last-minute decisions in a short period of time pretty cleanly? All that has to come into the risk assessment, and I think if you package that up, and that's part of the story to the program management, I think you can really sell the idea of how important this can be.
Okay, that leads nicely into another question that came in, where the interlocutor points out that any decision you're going to make, whether to maneuver, to remediate or not to remediate, implicitly at least, involves some level of statistical confidence. And by that, I don't think we just mean the probability of collision. That's the probability of collision, but how confident are we in the probability of collision that we're looking at? Both in terms of, in a standalone sense, that particular number, and then whether we think it's going to endure all the way to TCA. And we've talked about other things that feed into this, quality of OD and all that. When you formulate recommendations to your users, how do you represent your confidence in your recommendation or in the probability of collision that you think is determinative for this particular event? Mr. Holworth, let's start with you on that, and then we'll give each panelist a chance to wrestle with this problem.
Okay. Yeah. In the end, this collision probability really is the final metric that we use to make a decision. We have to, again, this comes from a little bit of the experience of doing this for a lot of years, even going back to the space shuttle through ISS. You start to, almost through, I don't know, an experience or I'd almost say it becomes intuitive at a certain point when certain conjunctions, regardless of what that collision probability are, you know that the answer, some of them you know the answer will change. Some of them you just, through experience, know, you have a feel for what the real risk is going to be. And I guess, an example of sort of two divergent types of scenarios where you might just treat things differently. One is the case of the 10 square meter rocket body coming right at your vehicle. It's low drag, well tracked, and you just have a certain, no matter what the collision probability is, it could be high or low, you have this a bit of a confidence that you're going to be able to make the right decision. And in fact, you can actually start your ops processes to be ready for that a lot earlier. And with more confidence. But when you've got a situation where you've got some very small object, high drag, it's just not tracked very well, with a very large uncertainty. And again, in the ISS altitude regime, in the 400 kilometer range, you will have debris objects that have a 1 sigma error of 1 in 200 kilometers, which makes it very difficult to sort of really commit to what that decision is going to be. And you're going to end up with a lot of I don't want to say false probability violations, but ones that'll trigger early in the game, and you just hope with subsequent tracking will go away. So in effect, when the rubber meets the road, you have to make a decision. It's the PC number that we go with. But I will say that in our world, especially in a high drag environment, we find that the later you can make that decision, the more likely it is that your decision is correct.
Okay. In moving on to Madame Moury on this, let me add a second part that the interlocutor also proposed, where he or she wondered, okay, so there's a statistical confidence, at least implicitly there. To what degree, if any, is it quantified? So we're going to provide data. We're going to at least give a general recommendation of the amount of confidence we have in the solution. Is that in any way a quantified attribute, or is it merely heuristic?
When we perform a recommendation, like for ISS, we also, our criteria is probability of collision. That's our final criteria. So we measure the level of risk according to the probability of collision. In order to compute the probability of collision, we use covariance provided in CDM. And we all know that covariance is difficult to estimate, and what's provided in CDM cannot be just taken as the truth. So we have to analyze the sensitivity of a realistic variation of covariance to the level of the probability of collision. That's what we try to do. We really think that we have to do something. We all know that covariances are not true figures, and so we provide to the operators the result of our sensitivity to those variations when we look at the probability of collision. So it means, what do I mean? I mean that we take the figure we have in CDM, and we know, according to all the parameters which are provided in the CDM, but also in the previous CDM we got. So we have the knowledge about some sort of confidence that we can have for the OD solution which is provided by JSPOC. I mean, for instance, we can have cases for when in each CDM we get, as time passes and we come closer to TCA, the solution remains compatible. So we are quite confident. So we would use we would not inflate too much the covariance. But sometimes what we get is not at all that good figure. And then we think that we need to consider and have a look if we have the probability we can compute using just what we have in CDM, but what we are looking for is to know if we are not at the edge of a cliff. You know, we have the probability of collision we compute, and we check if we change just a little bit one figure, which is realistic, in fact, and then probability of collision could be very much higher. So we could be at the bottom of a cliff. And that's really the way we work and how we try to provide a confidence in our analysis to our operators for which we provide recommendations.
All right. Shinichi-san, let me hand the question to you this way. Madame Moury, in her process, will massage the covariance to see what effect it will have on the PFC. And she points out quite correctly that sometimes the effect will be to increase the PFC, yes, sometimes yes, by a lot. Yes. Do you think then that the PFC used to enable the decision should be that higher value or not?
In our experience, we not only POC, but also another misdistance and historical trend is important. So we always check the historical change of the CDM. Sometimes, which is higher, altitude is higher, and sometimes switch, and sometimes orbit determination area, one sigma sphere is shift and cover each other. So we always understand the trend of the historical trend. So I don't say explicitly the detail because it is difficult. So it depends on the situation, not the same rule. So but we always check the POC, misdistance, historical change. Sometimes U dot radial. Velocity of the change, acceleration of the radial direction. So we combine everything and we judge how to, in this case, we change the orbit or not. Very
good. So finally to you, Mrs. Newman. What we've heard so far is we have to accept that the data aren't perfect, and we may massage them to try to get a sense of the degree of imperfection. But we're looking also at the same time the consistency throughout the event. I know for the Goddard approach, we still feel like we need to stay with the mean estimate for actually enabling decision support while we talk about the amount of confidence we have in that. How do you think that approach has worked over the last several years?
Well, we haven't had any collisions, so
okay.
Seems to Perfect. Be okay. That's truth data. But I mean, obviously, as you know, we're continuing to analyze the uncertainty in the PC and try to pick at it from different directions. There's a lot of variables that go into that. Each one has its own level of uncertainty. So trying to do what we can to remove as much of the uncertainty as we can. But I think this goes back to the question you posed previously, which was, is there like off-the-shelf software that's available that you can just push a button and get an answer? I think this shows why that's not really the case. You really need the experts to provide the manual analysis to feed back into the problem.
Okay, one final question. Question came in that's chastising us a little, but I think justly. I'll read it exactly as posed. We have still not addressed our plans for CA when the catalog goes from 20,000 to 200,000, and we know conjunction are happening tens of times a week, vice tens of times per year on a satellite. Now, that's related to this non-discrete CA technical challenge, but that was posed more as a kind of a technical research topic, which I think it is. But there are also huge ConOps implications to this. There's pacing of the entire process. There's whether the JSPOC is even equipped to send out notices on that number of discrete conjunctions. And this is no longer kind of a broadly futuristic item. I mean, if the published schedules are to be believed, in several years' time, we will have a space fence that is pushing us well that way. We're likely to have an SST observing platform in Australia that's going to increase the number of deep space objects by quite a bit. So we really do need to start thinking about how we'd even do business. So since I know none of us really has any kind of discrete plans for this, let me ask the question this way. What structures or entities or groups or working panels or whatever do you think we need to formulate, support, and maybe even fund so that we really do have an answer to this question so that when these sensors turn on, we're ready to use them? The last thing we want to do is spend all this money on new sensing technology, turn it on, and then find we're throwing away a good bit of the data because we haven't prepared from a command and control perspective to make good use of it. So I'm not asking here how we're going to solve the problem, i.e. in terms of specific solution, but how do we think we should go about formulating that solution? Because I don't think each of us working independently is a great way to do that efficiently.
So I don't know. This is a great question, and this is one of the ones that within my office we've been talking about a lot more lately because we simply, at this point, don't know how to respond to this. And I think the short answer is we're going to have to be doing things like this. We're going to have to just get this community together on a more frequent basis because this really affects everyone. It affects all the satellite operators. It affects the guys operating the space surveillance network and the JSPOC and the STRATCOM. It affects everyone. Because there are a lot of subtlety. It's one thing to say we're just going to multiply by 5 the number of objects, but my gut feeling is that not only is it going to be a catalog that's 5 times the size, it's probably going to all be objects that are unpredictable, that are high drag, and that can't be seen by any other sensor than the space fence. So you're going to be dealing with objects at this point that'll be flagging with, this is my intuition, extraordinarily large covariances. And it's going to do some funny things with the way we even calculate collision probability, I think. I think there's going to be breakdowns in even how well we can even assess the time these objects are going to come through our satellite's orbits. So I think there's a lot of technical and a lot of organizational and management and philosophical things we're going to have to work through that I have no answers for, and I think it's starting now.
Madame?
I think, in fact, we already have, even without increasing the number of objects in catalogs, the main problem we have is the accuracy of orbit determination. And I think we should work on that. And because if we, obviously, we plan to increase the catalog, we plan to observe more objects. But I think it's going to be useless if we do so without having a great research and work done in order to have a better accuracy on the orbit determination that we can get in catalog. Because when we think about it, all the avoidance action we perform, I think all of us were quite convinced that if we had had a better accuracy of the orbit determination for all those secondaries, those avoidance actions, most of them, would not have been needed. So my feeling is that that's really a big challenge. We already have it with the size of catalog we have today, and it's even more important when we plan to increase the number of objects in the catalog. So that's, I think, the way to deal with that, or one way to deal with the increase of objects in the catalog is really to find a way to have a better accuracy of the orbit determination. Otherwise, I think the number of objects, it would be useless. Just as you mentioned, the covariance you have is so huge, you cannot do anything with it. So what the use to have that object in your catalog, I could say.
Shinichi-san, where do you think we should begin
Yes,
to prepare for this large catalog?
I have a similar opinion of the Monique-san, and accuracy of orbit determination is very important. So, in my opinion, JAXA provides the ephemeris to JSPOC. JAXA provides the ephemeris of JAXA maneuverable satellite. So, in my opinion, all space agency provides the ephemeris to JSPOC. So, JSPOC only focus on the non-operated space debris. So, I believe the accuracy of the orbit determination is improves so much. So, in my image, with international cooperation with JSPOC, JSPOC can get the high accuracy orbit determination. So I hope the accuracy will improve year by year.
Okay. And Mrs. Newman, wrap all this up for us. How do you think we should go about figuring out what to do and putting the structures in place so that in several years' time we're prepared for a catalog that might increase by a factor of 10?
I think it's going to have to go back to what was suggested earlier about having some kind of international group who gets together routinely and addresses these technical problems and shares information with each other, because I don't think that any one group has the resources and to look at this problem and solve it on their own. I think we need to collaborate on it.
Very good. Well, please join me in thanking Mrs. Newman, Mr. Holworth, Madame Mukli, and Shinichi-san